South China Sea Resource and Economics. It's a presentation I gave last year. I guess the intermission between Professor Malley and Professor Malley again. So he'll come back about halfway through this talk and he'll continue with his take on the South China Sea. First, a bit about me. I guess I want to just explain who I am, why I'm here. Those of you familiar with the late Admiral James Stockdale. I've got a couple of books, Aid Dependence in Cambodia, How Foreign Assistance Undermines Democracy, which is about foreign aid and the problems of foreign aid in a specific country case, Cambodia, where I'm originally from. And The Hungry Dragon, co-authored book on how China's resource quest is reshaping the world. Case studies on China interacting in Angola, Brazil, and Cambodia, and what these countries are getting from China and what China is offering to these countries, both good and bad. A little bit more about myself. I have a TED Talk. I'm a young global leader of the World Economic Forum, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and I teach courses on political economy, courses that try to explain things like this. It's not very clear, the picture is really pixelated, but it's more or less a slum and a luxury area next to each other. How do you explain how a country essentially comes about to have this kind of outcome? My students, like you, are military officers, junior military officers typically, and they've gone to Afghanistan and Iraq, and they're trying to explain, or they're in other courses that I teach about post-conflict reconstruction, how essentially to rebuild countries after conflicts, right? So they want to get the Nation Building for Dummies guide or the A through Z list about how to rebuild a country. And I often have to tell them that it's not as simple as, say, building a house where you've got a blueprint and you've got the rooms and you're going to figure out where everything is going to be. It's not going to be as simple as that. Nation building is very hard. And it might even be possible for you to map out the various interactions through death by PowerPoint about how counterinsurgency works in Afghanistan, why the central government doesn't get the support that it deserves or whatnot, but it won't be as straightforward. That the work that we do is really a lot more like gardening, right? Gardening as metaphor. So perhaps the weather changes, we need to know about that. As non-locals, we're not going to know necessarily. We won't know about soil conditions. We might not know when pruning makes sense. And it's also about the illusion of control, which gardeners don't have. So gardening, on the other hand, may be a better metaphor. Gardeners have no illusion of control. We create the right growing conditions, nurture a healthy soil life, set up our lifestyle so we have time to tend our crops, and we plant a diverse variety of sturdy, healthy plants and watch them grow. We adjust as we go along, removing excess weeds, mulching, watering, and fertilizing when necessary, and picking off pests, but ultimately the end results almost always includes crop failures and unexpected successes. So in a way, if we say, failure is not an option, then at the same time success is not an option as well. And we will feel more like stewards, sometimes even observers, than masters of our domain. And I need to point this out. Last year, actually, a major, Joseph Ruhl, had a piece in Foreign Policy's blog about we need leaders who think like gardeners. And it was essentially the same argument I made in a more thought out sort of blog piece. Of course, you're listening to a guy who essentially does this to his plants. So, caveat emptor in that. So let's talk about the South China Sea and its resources and economics. Raise your hand if you know why everyone wants a piece of the South China Sea. Only a few of you, right? Thank you. All right, so shout out some reasons as to why. Resources, right? Oil, minerals. Essentially, all the things that are underneath as well as above in some cases. This is a map of the exclusive economic zone, which is essentially this idea that every country has got a right over, well, if it's landlocked, I guess it doesn't, but if it isn't, it has a right over 200 typically nautical miles out from its coastal area. So this is this idea that this EEZ is a sea zone prescribed by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, over which a state has special rights over the exploration and use of marine resources, including energy production from water and wind. It stretches from the seaward edge of the state's territorial sea out to 200 nautical miles from its coast. In colloquial usage, the term may include the territorial sea and even the continental shelf beyond the 200-mile limit. The U.S. actually is not a signatory to UNCLOS. China signed it in June 7th of 1996. So just to give you an idea, you've got your coast here, and you go out 200 nautical miles, and then you've got the continental shelf as well, which some countries claim. So, in the region of the South China Sea, you have essentially this EEZ claims of countries that are essentially very close to each other. And if you happen to have any kind of shoal or reef in the middle of the ocean, you can then claim the 200 nautical miles outward from there. So that certainly creates a lot of problems, and you have a better image here of what I'm talking about in all of these islands, these Spratly Islands and these reefs. Mischief Reef is one where the Chinese have certainly kept a lot of their naval facilities. Deng Xiaoping said, since we can't solve the South China Sea issue, we can leave it to the next generation, which will be smarter. Kicking that can down the road, obviously. And China's position on the EEZ is one that was made clear in 1998 when it passed its own exclusive economic zone and continental shelf act. The act created an exclusive EEZ with 200 nautical miles, which I've talked about already, but it includes security laws and regulations and international airspace. Of course, this is in dispute, but the fact is that the U.S. position, on the other hand, has been to protest this claim of sovereignty as a violation of international law. And it's done this numerous times. The U.S. government has long conducted a vigorous freedom of navigation program through which it has asserted its navigational rights in the face of what it has regarded as excessive claims by coastal states of jurisdiction over ocean space and international passages. And it does this by demonstrating its right and determination to go out into and sail and fly over these disputed regions. But what is really at stake in terms of resources? You have an area that is estimated to have as much as 30 billion metric tons of oil, 16 trillion cubic meters of gas, which would account, in China's case at least, to about 1/3 of China's oil and gas resources. And China currently has 2 billion tons of proven oil reserves, 99 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. The highest estimate of the number of barrels that could be in the South China Sea stands at about 213 billion. So in terms of proven and undiscovered oil reserves, the South China Sea ranges as high as 213 billion according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. And it surpasses every country's except Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. So this is what's at stake. And if you look at a map of where the proven oil reserves are and the newest claims, you're not even seeing in this map the South China Sea. I mean, it's not even on the radar screen yet because the potential hasn't even been tapped there. So why are then countries doing this? Well, they're of course trying to get the resources under the ocean for themselves. And the fact is they're going to have to, even if they get these resources, move them through shipping routes. Vietnam, for example, has already started its oil resource development through the installation of these here. And it, I think, tries very much to claim more for itself through disputed islands like the Paracels and the Crescent, because after all, once you have these reefs or shoals, you can then claim more resources around them. So you have essentially continuing disputes over the Spratly. It's a group of 250 uninhabitable islands spread over 427,000 square miles, 427 square kilometers, 165,000 square miles, which are claimed by China, Taiwan, and Vietnam, and partly by Malaysia, Brunei, and the Philippines. So you can just imagine the amount of conflict that could happen in such a small part of the world. And of course, the Chinese are guarding their assets, and they should. I mean, they believe that they have a right over those areas. if you think about Scarborough Shoal, which currently or last year was the biggest dispute, and I think it'll be talked about by Professor Mabry, you have a situation where essentially you could have a flashpoint. And the maritime claims of all the countries here, showing Brunei, China, Malaysia, Philippines, are so overlapping that you can only have a situation where conflict is going to happen eventually if something isn't done about it first. So the Indonesians, of course, are unhappy about the Chinese. And of course, as I mentioned last year, 2012, the hot real estate seemed to be this year. But it is true. I mean, once you set precedents and start putting ships in the area, the others can't really go there. So I think last year the problem was that 28 Chinese vessels and boats remained around Scarborough Shoal as of June, about a year ago, contrary to earlier reports that they had been moved out. So this is always a narrative that I think continues to be played out. And for the Philippines, at least, the only way that the Philippines can position itself in terms of this narrative is to say that China is trying to take over more than it deserves, and is trying to take over, frankly, not just Scarborough Shoal, but the rest of the world. The president of the Philippines here, Noynoy Aquino, welcoming the defense minister of China, who has said that China never intends to threaten any nation. But of course, what Professor Malley talked about earlier in terms of the ASEAN way, and sort of the problem of essentially going through policy making when you have to have consensus, or when you can't talk about internal divisions or domestic problems, is that you end up having a situation like this, where China versus ASEAN really doesn't look as unified as it ought to. And last year was a real, I think, example of that happening with some intrigue in Phnom Penh. So last year, Cambodia chaired the ASEAN ministers' meetings, and in July of 2012, actually, was the first indication of problems in the way that it chaired these meetings, because Cambodia essentially took the position that it objected to the final communique, which all the other 9 members had agreed to. And it did this at the behest, some would argue, of China, because essentially China wanted to keep the problem of South China Sea between itself and the ASEAN members and not bring in external partners, not internationalize it. So here's from Bloomberg on July 12, 2012. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations failed to reach consensus on handling disputes in the South China Sea, reflecting a rift between China and the U.S. over rules to keep peace in the trade lane. Cambodia, which holds the group's rotating chairmanship, rejected a compromise on the wording of the joint communique among the other 9 members in Phnom Penh. And Professor Malley talked about Indonesia's independent foreign policy. Certainly here, Foreign Minister of Indonesia, Marty Natalegawa, saying, "This is strange territory for me. It's very disappointing that at the 11th hour, ASEAN is not able to rally around a certain common language on the South China Sea. We've gone through so many problems in the past, but we've never failed to speak as one." Well, so I thought when this happened that it would be sort of a signal, a warning to Phnom Penh. Next time, try to play the ASEAN way, try at least to cooperate. But when the next opportunity, the next major opportunity came in November at the ASEAN summit that included President Obama at some point, the Secretary of State, which is actually a vice minister, so a deputy minister, Cao Kim Hoon, who's actually an old friend of mine, made a statement to the media that essentially solidified Cambodia's position with respect to the narrative of how the ASEAN members had decided that they would not internationalize the South China Sea from now on. And this is basically a script from China. The spokesperson for the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs has said, for example, "We oppose the internationalization of the South China Sea." I mean, the word internationalization in this context is really a code word that China uses to say, we're not going to involve others, we're just going to talk among ourselves, and that way we'll keep it in-house. The argument, I think, was that China had essentially bought a seat at the ASEAN table through Cambodia. And it's clear, I mean, in the other research I've done, I've shown how Cambodia has received an incredible amount of largesse from China. China has given over $2 billion in bilateral aid and loans to Cambodia in recent years. That's at least twice as much as what the country receives from all other donors combined in any given year. And building the vital roads and other infrastructure while the Western-driven aid effort flounders amid alleged mismanagement and government corruption in Cambodia. So China doesn't care about human rights. China doesn't talk about corruption. China is perfectly happy, sending money, bags of money to Cambodia to do whatever the country wants, and in exchange, Cambodia is then essentially doing whatever China wants when it comes to last year in ASEAN. So Chinese companies have invested about $8 billion since 2006. That's by far the biggest investor in a country of 15 million people. As one diplomat, unnamed diplomat, yes?
How does their aid not get stuck up in bureaucracy and Western aid does?
Well, first of all, their aid is controlled by their Ministry of Commerce. So it's very clear that they're not dealing with, they're not looking at aid in the way that Western donors think about aid. They don't think about it in terms of, let's give aid in order to improve transparency or accountability, all those things that are human rights, God forbid. For China, the entire purpose is let's build the Council of Ministers building for the Cambodian government. Let's do the new Senate complex compound. Or they want a bridge, let's just build it for them. Of course, they bring in their Chinese workers and build it for them, which is a major drawback when you think about how foreign aid should be helping the people of that country do it themselves or maybe get more jobs as a result of it. But that's the deal. They agree to do something and then they bring in the workers. And in the case of even the Council of Ministers, when Chinese workers built it, the Prime Minister of Cambodia wouldn't use the building afterwards to put his offices because he thought that it would be bugged, but he said it was just bad feng shui there and he didn't want to use it. So he had another building next to it built instead, but it was also built by the Chinese or with Chinese money. So it's very interesting. The bottom line is U.S. and other Western donors have all these rules about making sure there's no corruption, and the Chinese really don't care about it because that's not part of their agenda.
It helps them in the sense of their excess labor force that they have on mainland China, so they gotta get people to work, and then in addition to that, it gets them votes and support and other.
Right, so it's like a domestic jobs program exported overseas. Some of them actually stay afterwards. You hear reports of Chinese staying in Africa long after they've left or been done with the project.
Because there are women in Africa that they could be.
Perhaps, but it certainly does not seem to suggest that they're interested in creating jobs for Africans or for Cambodians or for Angolans, for Brazilians. They're just trying to do whatever activity will result in the building, the bridge, or whatever the road that they want. So one of the diplomats who remains unnamed here said China bought the chair, simple as that. Cambodia refused to play the customary role of seeking agreement among the 10 participating countries, thus undermining the possibility of an accord. And then he said, that essentially, pointed out that China's foreign minister had said that Cambodia had thanked Cambodia's prime minister for supporting China's core interests in essentially taking the position of not internationalizing the dispute over the South China Sea. And that's something that, of course, was very much not agreed upon by other members of ASEAN sitting at the table, primarily Noino Aquino, who reacted this way. Quote, there were several views expressed yesterday on ASEAN unity, which we did not realize would be translated into an ASEAN consensus. For the record, this was not our understanding. The ASEAN route is not the only route for us. As a sovereign state, it is our right to defend our national interests. So he's not playing along. And of course, he had more to say on this, which was that there was no agreement that on the exclusive ASEAN framework to be used. We depend on international and the United Nations. And a multilateral problem does not lend itself to a solution on a bilateral basis. If you cross national borders, then it becomes an international situation, and it could be dealt with through the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea or some other means. The reaction from the Cambodian side, of course, was to sort of walk that back and say, countries are free to raise whatever issues they please. Now, that's where it was left at in 2012. It was kind of a very bad situation in terms of Cambodia, Philippines relationship, and other countries. Vietnam also wasn't happy. Singapore was not on board with Cambodia either, and Japan spoke as well as to its understanding of what the discussion was. More recently, in 2013, I think that the dispute has been centered again on the Philippines and China, it seems, with a different reef this time. We continue to have problems with Scarborough Shoal, but this time it's on the second Thomas Reef, which the Filipinos call Ayungin Reef. And it's essentially located here. You've got the yellow parts controlled by the Filipinos, and then the red parts by China, green Vietnam, Malaysia in blue, Taiwan in pink. So you have a situation where everybody's putting their flag and saying, this is ours, and we're not going to move from there. And just to give you a better sense of what's happening with respect to Ayungin Reef, essentially you have this World War II ship, which I guess got stuck there in 1999 or some such. But that's where the Filipinos have said, this is what we're keeping for ourselves. China actually, most recently, early July, had a very sort of interesting exchange with the Philippine secretary, foreign secretary, or minister of foreign affairs, actually. So they made an offer, the Chinese made an offer to move that ship. So Del Rosario, the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Philippines, said that Wang, the Secretary the Foreign Secretary of China, said Scarborough and Ayungin were theirs historically, and we were the ones sending ships, interdicting their fishermen, and the grounded ship has been there for so long. And when Del Rosario said to Wang, was asked, why aren't you moving this? He said, we don't have the money to move it. And the Chinese said, well, move it for you. So it's clearly a situation where obviously you've got two countries that are disputing areas that will in the future mean for them access to resources that they want to claim. And I'm certainly not sure what's going to happen next. This is certainly to be continued, but I'm happy to take any more of your questions if you have any. Yes.
With respect to the overlapping territorial claims in the South China Sea, even if you remove China from the equation entirely, or kicked Cambodia out of ASEAN,
Yeah.
would the ASEAN nations honestly believe that they could come to some kind of agreeable dialogue in the South China Sea?
No, I think that what unifies them right now is the gorilla, the 800-pound gorilla. So China being there, and of course, Cambodia annoys them because Cambodia is acting like China's client in all this, and essentially communicating everything that China wants. So the Philippines will say things like, we have already a Chinese ambassador, why do we have two Chinese ambassadors, right? So it's definitely a situation where I think, right now at least, they're unified around the fact that there's this very large country that is powerful in respect to each country's size, and even with respect to ASEAN size. And so they can at least say, well, we're not happy with how China is behaving. It's the bad guy in the picture. It won't go through the code of conduct that it needs to. But you're right. I mean, remove, in a hypothetical exercise, remove China, remove Cambodia's bad behavior, and you will have the remaining countries probably arguing with one another over what's left.
Right, but there was some language written, sorry, just follow on. Wasn't there some language that was being voted on and Cambodia was the only either abstaining or contradictory vote? And if they had done what the other nations had wanted them to do, they would have been able to put something out, right?
Right, because they communicate about the South China Sea. Instead, they didn't send any communique out at all.
Right, but the communique would have been something that was just vague.
Of course. Just basically saying, probably we're very concerned about what's happening in the South China Sea. We need to make sure that everybody behaves themselves, and that's a message to China in a very nice, sort of not too confrontational way.
Are there a couple of planes taking it through the Port Settlement? What's the status of that?
Well, I don't have the latest on that, but I do know that I'd like to understand that there is that route that certainly the Philippines wants to exercise. I think the idea there is, hey, if we can't get it done through ASEAN and bilaterally, we are going to get it done through some other body because we're not happy with the situation as it currently stands. It's not giving us the satisfaction of figuring out an amicable outcome. And of course, when you're dealing with China and the resources that China offers to all of these countries, it's very lopsided in terms of capabilities.
Does China kind of feel in this sort of situation that, yeah, all these other countries may be, claiming rights, but when push comes to shove, all China really needs to do is just exert continuous constant pressure, and nobody's really going to be willing to pull the trigger.
Right. Well, that's the thing. I think that just like the U.S. does it itself in terms of going out and demonstrating that it can be in those areas that are claimed by China, and if China does the same thing and goes there and might makes right essentially in international relations, then it will, who will be there? But I think for a lot of these countries, going closer to the U.S. when it comes to this dispute means, hey, we've got a big brother that's going to stand up for us in case you abuse us, right? So that's why there's always this need to somehow say, the U.S., what's your position? Don't you agree with us that China needs to do the code of conduct?
Isn't it in the interest of everyone other than China to actually go the international route and just go ahead and make their claims and see where the chips fall? Because more time will allow China to build bigger airports or move ships that declare as military property off the route.
No, I
essentially legitimizes China's money, so China's not the advantage of these other countries.
Right. And I agree. I think they want that, but then they also have to weigh. I suppose look for the countries that have more at stake because they've already established. The Philippines, you could see it has way more of the islands in yellow there than I think Taiwan. It's small potatoes. Taiwan isn't obviously part of ASEAN, but there's certainly, I think, a need there for, if you were to count it up, you would say, the big two players here are Philippines in this part of the South China Sea at least, and China, and then I think in green you'd have Vietnam, but then Malaysia is kind of off to the side there, and certainly Taiwan isn't. So I think for the Philippines and Vietnam internationalizing it, perhaps, I'm not sure about Malaysia necessarily, but of course everybody wants to level the playing field, and that's what internationalizing the situation really means for them.
Have they all signed UNCLOS?
I'm not sure if they've all signed UNCLOS. I would have to check that.
And where does, they talked about going through the course, but this was all driven by claims all had to be made by a certain date, right? So.
Well, it's interesting. Like China will go back to some, 500-year-old thing claiming that we were here then, and therefore, we have every right to claim this today. In the end, it's whether you're there when it matters, right? If you can't even remove a ship because you're claiming you don't have the resources to do that, you're not looking very strong on the international stage when you're dealing with China. I think he probably got tricked into making a statement that he can't walk back from that standpoint. But I think it's very dangerous when you're dealing with lopsided resources like China and not being able to actually say much other than we'll go to another power or we'll go to an international body to dispute this.
So it seems as though none of these little reefs can support life in the traditional way that UNCLOS looks at the language, right? To be able to support human habitation.
Right.
Nobody seems to care over there.
Yeah, I think as you can see, at the moment that they're able to set up some flag and to do is essentially a claim of some kind there. next thing you know, if around this a Chinese ship shows up, they'll be gone. I mean, it simply is the case that the resources will, I think, determine who ends up taking more of their share.
If I can, I'd offer a couple of counterpoints to balance the view from Beijing. First of all, international scholars in general will point out that nobody has a good claim to the sovereign resources in the South China Sea, that China's is probably as good as anybody else's. And in fact, UNCLOS doesn't provide a really workable framework for resolving the historical claims that Chinese are making. So that's number one. Point number two is, and I'm not a Beijing apologist, but as fashionable as it is to demonize Beijing for their actions in East China Sea and South China Sea, most scholars, or at least a significant number of scholars, will point out to you that Beijing is merely counterpunching. That it was the Philippines and Japan that altered the status quo in both the South China Sea and East China Sea. And if you understand Beijing's concept of escalation control, their response is to go higher and above because you've given them an opportunity to do so. So they've raised the bar for Scarborough Shoals and for the Yaoyu or Senkaku Islands because they were given an opportunity, at least from Beijing's perspective, to do so by this change of status quo. Now, that doesn't excuse, I'm not for a minute, again, apologizing for Beijing's behavior or condoning it. It just provides some insight as to why we're seeing the dynamics that we are now. It is not, in my opinion, that Beijing is aggressively and unilaterally asserting their sovereignty in these two areas. They have a very long-term incremental approach that they're executing. Now, Craig, having said that, if you analyze the South China Sea as a flag point, of all the areas in the Pacific region, perhaps less the Korean Peninsula, this is where one would assert that there's the highest probability of some kind of conflict emerging. And because the U.S. is a treaty ally with two of those claimants, the East China Sea, the South China Sea, Japan, the Philippines, and a growing defense partner with Vietnam, there's a real probability that Washington gets pulled into a conflict involving a bunch of rocks and shoals that we really, I would argue, at least esoterically, do not have a lot of vested interest.
Absolutely, yeah, I think you've nailed it. Yeah.
So to that point, just now, then, if that's part of China's strategy is to go above and beyond the last salvo, if you will, are they re-anchoring the discussion at that point higher so that, and will they accept a compromise, or are they expecting something less than what they just thrown out? Or are they all or nothing with their claims?
No,
Is there an offer?
That's a great question, and I think at the end of the day, Beijing will never accept some kind of compromise in the South China Sea in which their interests are not fully vested and fully represented. So while there may be compromise, it's certainly not going to look like the compromise in the Philippine seas or the Vietnam seas. And so I guess in aggregate, the answer is no. I mean, Beijing's pretty much all in on this. And by the way, Beijing has articulated that this is one of their infamous core interests. And when they do that, the Communist Party tends to back itself into a corner. And you tell your people this is a core interest, and it's not easy to back your way out of it. So I don't think that there's a lot of flexibility involved. And I'm sorry, one last point that is of interest is that if you study the last 40 years of altercations in the South China Sea, it wouldn't surprise you to know that Vietnam and China have been involved in a great majority of them. But it might surprise you to know that the Philippines has actually been involved in more altercations with China than Vietnam has, and then that's alarming. And in fact, ASEAN roundly criticized the Philippines for their lack of diplomatic finesse in the way Scarborough Shoals.
To which criticism are you referring? Is that recently, or you mean back in 1970s and 80s?
No, I'm
What
talking
kind of
about
applications are you?
2012, ASEAN, there were a number of ASEAN countries that criticized the lack of diplomatic skill with which Manila handled the crisis. And so there was, the point I guess I'm making is there's not universal finger pointing at Beijing in all of this.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of blame to go around for the misbehavior of a lot of these countries.
speaking of that, Cambodia and Laos, they're landlocked, right?
No, Cambodia is not landlocked, Laos is landlocked.
Does
Yeah.
Cambodia have, and I don't see the map, only 19 claims for China?
No, it's not, fortunately,
If you
look,
got two countries
yeah,
within ASEAN that don't have a vested interest in the South China Sea, those are levers, obviously, that China can use to basically throw ASEAN to the side as a venue for these other nations to go ahead and get their claims seen in the
right.
on the world stage. And the question is, when do these nations stop thinking about ASEAN as a vehicle and look to something outside, like you're talking about, the United States or some other entity to fix it?
Well, I think it's baked into the cake, right? ASEAN's history, ASEAN's way of doing business makes it very difficult for it to essentially have disputes among its members sorted out in a way that works. I mean, the example in recent years of Cambodia and Thailand having this temple, Prepahia, and the land around it in dispute has led, to really uncomfortable situations between two members of one association that was never supposed to be an alliance from the beginning, and therefore isn't behaving really like one. It's where it makes sense for them, they go together, and then where it doesn't, I guess they're not. And you're absolutely right, this divide and conquer strategy of China with respect to those members of ASEAN that have no dispute or have no particular interest in the South China Sea makes perfect sense. I mean, they can buy them off and get them to say whatever it is they want.
Despite China pushing, getting back to the government being pushed into a corner and kind of flexing their muscle to the point that they changed their watermark on their passport to include all these areas and just kind of say, we got it.
Yeah.
Aren't the post-World War II allies, aren't we kind of responsible for this mess to begin with, in that we never described we never divided up these islands, when we divided up everything else, we just kind of left those in no man's land, that just kind of let this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is a colonial legacy issue per se because of our past with the Philippines or with our past with Japan or whatnot, but yeah, I mean, if you want to look at it that way,
Is there a reason why they left it alone and they didn't divide it? Like we divided everything else up.
I don't think anybody thought there was anything there necessarily that could be tapped. Now suddenly it seems like, wait a minute, there's a lot of potential resources there. Whether it can be gotten to is a totally different story, right? So it's proven versus unproven reserves, and as with technology, now we have fracking, the ability to get to way more than we thought was possible. It's emerging into the picture. So that's why 50 years ago it didn't seem to matter.
But to that excellent point, both Taipei and Beijing make the same argument that China's equities were not represented at the Potsdam Proclamation when things were divvied up, and they should have been. And I was talking to Minter Hong here. If you look at KMP charts of the South China Sea post-World War II, they have the 9-dash line. China's long position has been on both sides of the strait that this has been a Chinese territory. And again, not apologizing for Beijing, but their position is that Western states chose to ignore that to pursue their own interest or lack of interest.
So to add your answer, you said why they did not dissolve every single time. Let's say when Hong Kong returned to China, okay, you only return Hong Kong and Kowloon territories to China. You never say including 100, 2,036 islands to China. Because after the Second World War, China never represented that wholesale declaration thing. So Japan why on the word game saying that, well, you mentioned about Taiwan, Formosa Island, but not Senkaku Island. So that's why every country will do it from the national interest point of view. From my personal opinion, there's no good guy and bad guy in this type of dispute. And everybody will pay a claim because there's money there.
Well, because right after World War II, I mean, it was a different Chinese. It was the Chinese that ended up in Taiwan for the government at the time. So it was kind of a different China at that point.
Although their position is, we fought alongside you, Western states. We were your staunch ally, and this is the reward we get. And so, again, not apologizing or condoning Beijing's actions, but there is some historic baggage here that helps you better understand the dynamic today.
And I just want to confirm this, that the 9-dash line or that yellow line you see up there,
was from the Chinese people that went to Taiwan, right?
Yeah, that's KMT. You're talking about
KMT,
5T,
so, you know, it's not from the communist side, the side we support it. So that yellow line, for those that weren't here last year, is the 9-dash line that China claims.
How would you define U.S. interests in this area, or what would you define as the core U.S. interest? And what is the scenario, how would you define the scenario, or what would it look like? What would a worst-case scenario for the U.S. look like in this region?
Right.
Resolution?
Well, I think the second part of your question is easier to explain. I think what the U.S. Definitely ought to try to avoid is getting ensnared in a dispute over, as we were talking about, some reefs, rocks, whatnot, because it has defense, mutual defense agreement of some kind, where they're essentially, it's not worth it for us to get really into a dispute about this. Now, I think I had some slides here about the U.S. position. What's this one? And I think generally speaking, the U.S. is trying to be able to go around that region in a way that is not fettered, is not somehow restrained, and by remonstrations and protestations, if they don't work, the U.S. is still going to go there. So freedom of navigation in this area, freedom to operate is certainly one position. I don't think the U.S. is saying we want to have any of these resources for ourselves or anything like that. That's certainly not in our interest at this time.
What is a pivot to Asia going to use?
Well, I think certainly we're understanding that China's increasing strength has meant that we need to be ready for whatever happens in that region and to refocus our energy towards containing or at least making sure that conflicts don't go out of control there.
You know that oil resources still continues over in that region, though, correct? I mean,
Yes, I mean, I think I had a slide of how Vietnam is doing its work. Now, it's not going out very far off of its coast, but certainly I think that the moment that any country is secure enough in claiming a certain part, it will want to begin having exploration there.
If it turns out that all this resources are unfounded,
Mhm.
do you think that's going to change anything? Or do you think the Chinese are
Pretty
sure?
sure.
Well, I don't
Fishing
care
is
if it's resources there or not. I'm going to use that as a way to poke the West and see what we can do.
Well, and I should say even the 213 billion barrels is the high-end estimate. I think it goes down to as low as 30 billion barrels. But a lot of this, as I said previously, is a matter of how do you get to the resources. If you can't get to the resources, they're no good to you. I mean, it might be technologically too difficult to get to them. Over time, of course, your technology improves and you're able to get to more difficult areas. But as others have said, there are other resources there, even aside from this, just the right marine resources and so on that you would be interested
Right,
in
but
claiming.
if there were nothing there, it was just nothing, just but a rock. Is anybody going to China or the other countries that care, or is it, we don't care if it's resources or not. We're gonna, it's ideological, we own it, whatever, historical, whatever.
Yeah.
We want it.
China would care because this is part of the Chinese dream
Yeah, right.
of reclaiming territories that were once under Chinese sovereignty. And so whether Taiwan has any value or the Senkakus resource-wise or the South China Sea is important, but not necessarily the driver for these initiatives. So to the Captain's earlier question, it's hard for me to envision for any reason Beijing ever letting this go because they've made this a matter of national pride and a national goal now, a so-called core income.
The fishing rights are huge though as well.
But my point is there was nothing.
Yeah.
To the question here, if there was no resources at all, it would still, in my opinion, be an issue to Beijing that would be aggressively pursued.
You have to be careful here because the core interest statement that was made in 2010 and attributed to various, apparently made initially in the meeting, the U.S. officials in Beijing, it was widely discussed during 2010 Shangri-La dialogue, moments between the Secretary Gates and Chinese counterpart, and it was generally viewed by China watchers we have around here and the people I spoke to at that time as something that China was walking back. Now, we can attach too much significance to the words themselves, and too little to the actions. And I think that I want to make sure that we don't attribute too much significance to those words, because there's a lot of question among the China watchers who I deal with about whether the South China Sea should be seen in the same light as, say, Tibet. Nonetheless, the actions that we've seen China undertake in the past few years do tend to lead us to the understanding of these islands as a core interest of some kind, although perhaps not in exactly the same category that many people interpreted it to be in 2010. Okay, so this is one of those phrases that seems like it's got taken on a life of its own. I don't know. Do you want me to do some of the background stuff?
Yes, in fact, I've taken more than half the time that you and I both had.
Right.
So you're welcome to re-plug in whenever.
Well, one of the
Press,
questions
before you
I
get
have-
off there,
Yeah.
I did want to press on one thing you said. You said if you can't get these resources, why would you argue over them? Well, if they're petroleum resources, they only become more valuable over time.
Mm.
Therefore, it's long-term national wealth.
Right.
So, Saudi Arabia is only developing a certain amount of oil because they know the more along the oil sits, the more valuable it gets. You're looking at some of these other countries that,
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah,
national
no,
wealth. Yeah.
I guess, having it in case, the appreciation of the value of these resources, even if you can't tap them right now.
And there's always, multinational companies that will come in for a price.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. In the case of Cambodia, which doesn't have any claim of the South China portions, but it was found to have, by Chevron, to have several areas of interest, and some would say it's already spent the money that was underneath there without tapping any of it yet. So that's certainly a possibility. Okay.
Hey,
Yes.
Bill, you made comments about allies, and our ally is the Civil Ministry that we have,
Mhm.
and as the U.S. kind of wanes geopolitically, and what is your thought, and can we afford to leave our ally, the Philippines, hanging out to dry? And I know it's just a rock,
Right.
but is backing up our ally fighting for a rock?
Well, I think that the devil is in the details, right? So what Noynoy Aquino is going to want from President Obama is a commitment that action will be taken even over that rock versus how to finesse essentially the argument that in fact we're talking about something more serious, like you're getting attacked on your main territory as opposed to some area.
Bread and shoes, it's only like 3 days long, it's
Yeah.
fast food, and it leaves a lot of wiggle room for us.
A lot of wiggle room. All of these are not written ways that essentially tie our hands permanently, thank goodness. But the credibility of the U.S. in a waning power situation is certainly at stake, and I think that with furloughs, with sequestration and all these things, we're already sending a signal that we're retrenching in terms of resources, maybe not from Asia, but certainly retrenching in terms of resources, and are not able to project quite the financial prowess we once had. Okay, thank you.
Hey, President.